Hi, everyone. Today we're going to look at the issue about did the original Hebrew Matthew say that Miriam was in the line of David, and that when she gives birth to Jesus, therefore he's now in the line of David because she's in the line of the generations that are listed beforehand. Okay, so in other words, does it say something to the effect Joseph was the father of Miriam? Okay, so that's uh, what Nehemiah Gordon is going to say. Now, it turns out well, that's all I'm going to say for the moment. But a lot of people do not understand that Nehemiah Gordon is dealing with a 13th century manuscript, and he makes a point over and over again. He's not talking about this is what it originally said. He can't say anything about that. He is not saying it was originally in the Hebrew of Matthew. He's just simply saying there are of the 26 Shem Tob 13th century manuscripts, and these are mostly coming out of Spain, and we'll see why. There's 3 of the 26 that he found that had Joseph, father of Miriam, okay, in the thing. Now, I want to just throw out that you have to understand is that the problem in the early manuscripts was noted by Jerome, and Jerome suggested this very solution would correct things, but he hadn't found it, and he's the one looking at the Hebrew Matthew in 293. So if it said it, he would have told us. He's literally translating the Hebrew Matthew, and the answer to the question is if it was the real reason why the Hebrew Matthew doesn't exist anymore and his translations don't exist anymore is there's something in the manuscripts they didn't want us to see. And the reason they probably didn't want us to see it is that Jerome preserved the fact it didn't say anything about Mary or anything about anyone but Joseph begat Jesus. And that became heresy because what helps support the Trinity doctrine, which became much more paramount than anything else, is if Jesus is God from birth. And that would really seal the deal. If he becomes, that God begets him at his baptism, well, that's not good enough. We want it all the way at his birth. So this became a paramount concern. But if anybody could have said it came from Mary, Jerome, who actually argued for that, but he argued it. He said that's what he thinks would have been what Luke meant, and so he was looking that way. But anyway, this is suspicious, therefore, that it comes up 12, how many years later after Jerome first suggested? So he's suggesting this around, let's say, 400 AD, and it shows up, how many years? 700, 800 years later, approximately 800 years later, there's 3 errant manuscripts in the manuscripts that are being held by the Jewish people. Okay, and so where these came from, nobody really knows where they came from. It's just the Jewish people had collected these in the 1200s to do disputations. So I want you to hear Nehemiah Gordon explain the context in which the Shem Tobs were collected in the first place, how they were created for and for what purpose.
And in this case, they must have written in the margin and in the foreign tongue, Christos. Why would they write that? Because the Jews who were copying this in the time of Shem Tob, the purpose was to debate the Catholics. They were forced into these debates called the disputations. They were forced into these disputations against the Catholics to defend Judaism. And so in order to do that, they had to read what's in the New Testament. And so if you're debating with the Catholic, calling a Mashiach isn't going to help. You got to know what the Latin word is. And so here it says in the foreign tongue Christos, that's a later gloss. So here...
Okay, so this is what he's referring to. This is from the Jewish Wikipedia.info, and they point out in an article called Disputation in the Jews, and it's from a book called Jews, God and History by Max Nemant, 1994, and they have video on it as well. And what are these? The religious disputation was the innovation of apostate Jews, meaning these are Jews who had gone over to become Christians, many of whom had studied the Talmud. To show their learning to their new Christian brothers, or perhaps to curry favor with the church, they suggested that a public disputation would show how wrong the Jews were, and then the entire Jewish community might convert. These religious disputations, called tournaments of God and faith, were a combination of intellectual chess and Russian roulette. If the Jewish scholars could not disprove the charges of the Christian scholars arrayed against them, then an entire Jewish community faced the threat of a forced march to the baptismal font. If, on the other hand, they mocked the Christian scholars with superior Jewish scholarship, they ran the danger of being put to death. It took gamesmanship of the finest order to walk the thin thread of a ploy which ceded victory to the other side without yielding on the main points. Only those with strong nerves survived, and the scholarship, audacity, and deftness survived, and the judges, which might include a pope or an emperor, were often left agape at the Jewish display of scholarship, audacity, and deftness. Sorry about that. The Jews usually won by not checkmating their opponents, but by stalemating them. The trick was to drive the opponent into a corner where, if he claimed victory, he would have to deny the authority of the Old Testament, which would have been heresy. Luther, who was familiar with such disputations, borrowed this technique in his disputations with the Catholic. Anyway, so you could just see. And then it's interesting, the dates match up and line up a lot with the Shem Tob. So you see 1240, the Disputation of Paris. This was the reign of Louis XIV, between a member of the Franciscan order who had earlier converted from Judaism and four of the most distinguished French rabbis. So they brought the best rabbis in. The Commission of Christian Theologians condemned the Talmud to be burned. On June 17, 1244, 24 carriage loads of Jewish religious manuscripts were set on fire in Paris. You see, this is not a time of free speech. Would you agree? The Disputation of Barcelona, which is definitely where Shem Tob would be wanting to be employed. And this is the right dates. This matches the dates of a lot of the Shem Tob. Shem Tobs are going to get into the 1300s as well here, you'll see. Before King James I of Aragon, between the monk Pablo Cristiani, a convert from Judaism, and Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, also known as Nachmanides. At the end of the disputation, the king awarded Nachmanides a monetary prize and declared that never before had he heard, quote, an unjust cause so nobly defended. The Dominicans claimed the victory, and Nachmanides was exiled, so these were very risky disputations. His report of the proceedings was condemned and burned. So his report, he couldn't even do a summary that would be left to speak. So what did we learn in the movie 1984 in the book? Is whoever controls the records controls the present. Whoever controls the present controls the past. Whoever controls the past controls the future. It's a diabolical scheme that George Orwell puts in the mouth of the interrogator. And it's just brilliant because it's exactly what they do. They control the narrative by destroying free speech, and that means controlling records and taking away the past and the future away from people. And you are under their control. 1375, public disputation held at Burgos and Avila. I think that's in Spain or near Spain, by Moses Cohen de Tordesillas with converts from Judaism, John of Valladolid and Abner of Burgos. Another disputation was held at about the same time in Pampeluna by Shem Tob ben Isaac Shaprut of Tudela with Cardinal Don Pedro de Luna. Afterward, Avignon Pope Benedict XIII, the disputation being made the subject of the books Ezer Emunah by Moses and Eben Bohan. So I hope we get the idea now that this is a life and death situation where they have to know the arguments will land by knowing what the current Latin Vulgate says. So this is not where they're going to try to play games, and certainly not try to offend the Catholics. They're trying to just survive and not be destroyed and not killed and not exiled. So this is not a contemplative thing. However, the Hebrew Matthew that they created to be ready to defend themselves, so you have to ask, why did they do that? Because there must have been a tradition earlier in time when they were preserving, somebody in their community had preserved the original Hebrew Matthew. Remember, it existed until at least 293 AD when Jerome translates it. So there had to be some sources of the Hebrew Matthew somewhere, and these must have been dug out. But because of the pressure of fighting the current version of the Bible, they couldn't leave it there. They had to translate it, but translate in a language they know how to read, which is Hebrew, and then use that in their debates. So they had to be current. They had to reflect current wordings and readings so they could win the debate. So there was this pressure to do that. And you have to also then consider it would be on the issue of the virgin birth would be a heavy pressure, very heavy pressure that they conform to the virgin birth narrative. And they can't, they're not allowed to dispute our scriptures, right? So if our scriptures say there's a virgin birth, the pressure is on them to make sure there's something that would help the virgin birth be present. So they're not going to get involved in an argument on that. And maybe they would throw out this idea of Mary, maybe Mary, but they know that Mary being in the lineage. So I'll just give you a heads up on that. That doesn't make Jesus a lineage of the house of David, because it's done through the male line, not the female line. So that's a whole nother problem. And they would know that, so they could just throw it out there and you wouldn't know. You, the dumb Gentile, don't know that doesn't prove anything. Doesn't prove a Davidic lineage yet. Okay, so that's what the context of this is. So now I want you to hear. I'm going to put Nehemiah Gordon on so you can hear what happened with Mr. Rood. Is Mr. Rood went too far, and something Nehemiah Gordon had speculated about there maybe would be something like Mary could be the door in the line, and he's not telling Rood anything about the limitations that to be of the house of David, you have to be a male. He's just speculated at this. Then Rood told crowds of people this was so, put it in a book. And Nehemiah Gordon, in this episode, you're going to see that he's saying, I heard you telling all these crowds that this was not, this was true. And lo and behold, I'm, and you'd already done 40 talks on it. And basically he's saying you were saying something that I didn't say. And then he says, I'm there working at the Tel Aviv, whatever, on the microfiche player. And I see, there it is. And he finds 1, 2, and 3 eventually, where this says a father of Miriam, Joseph, had given birth. It was in the line of Jesus in Matthew. So it is a strange coincidence that what was a speculation of Nehemiah Gordon originally, that was repeated multiple times with no foundation by Mr. Rood to crowds, turned out to be correct. But it's still, while it has a lot of amazing aspects to it, I think that's pretty good. It's like amazing that his guess was right. It still doesn't add up to anything. And in the greater context of a debate where the Jewish person is put on the defense to try to put on, a defense that can't contradict our scripture, this would be the way they could get around it to themselves. They would just say, hey, let's just say that, Miriam is in the line. That we know that doesn't accomplish anything, but it will get them off our backs if they claim you don't believe in our scripture, because maybe the original Hebrew Matthew didn't have anything but that Joseph was in the line. I mean, it's possible, and so they have to conform to our scripture in order to have a debate with us. Do you see the point? So they're under heavy pressure to make sure it sounds a lot like what they're doing. Otherwise, they're going to be looked at as heretics who will be killed for taking a position that the virgin birth account isn't correct. Can you see the point? So there's no way you can trust anything there that would support the virgin birth in any kind of variant. It would be completely for purposes of survival and not being executed and killed by the Catholic Church. And you can just see that's already going on. Even when they win a debate, they're still going to be killed if it's not perfect. Okay, so let me play for you Nehemiah Gordon explaining this whole thing about how it came up, where he was worried that Rood is putting out something that he can't back up, and then he fortunately finds the very thing on the microfiche. Okay, so I'm going to play a clip from this YouTube of Nehemiah Gordon's YouTube channel, Joseph, the father of Mary, Hebrew Matthew 1, verse 16. And this is where Michael Rood is going to admit that Nehemiah Gordon disagreed with him, even though he was representing and saying apparently that Nehemiah Gordon backed him up. And Nehemiah Gordon is saying, I don't back you up. And what you're saying is stretching the Aramaic too far to say that Joseph begat Miriam as a child. And so they're in the background having this dispute, and Nehemiah Gordon has had to watch him say this in 40 different times. But Nehemiah Gordon goes and tries to see if he can find anything that would back up what was in the Aramaic could be found in the Hebrew Matthew. And but here's first from Michael Rood, where he is agreeing to take a beating in the public view that we now know that he was stretching the truth. And so let's listen to him talk about
The whole thing with Joseph and the relationship with Miriam. Can you set that up real quick?
Okay, very, very quickly. Nehemiah was on the road with me as we were doing the Raiders of the Lost book. And so I was using the Aramaic text because I saw a problem here. It says there are 14 generations from David to the carrying away to Babylon, to the carrying away to Babylon unto Messiah. When you count them, there are only 13. And you can read it in English. There are only 13 generations. We've got a problem right there. And so the Aramaic, I was using the Aramaic text, and I was using an interpretation. Nehemiah would say it wasn't really a translation. I was really squeezing this thing to say that Joseph, his father was the son, he was the son of Yaakov, and this Joseph was the father of Miriam. And so I'll let Nehemiah pick it up from there, because that is then when you have Joseph, the son of Yaakov, the father of Miriam, instead of the husband of Miriam, now you have 14. But yet in the later verses, it says that Joseph, her husband. In Aramaic, that's a different word. And so that was my take on it. That is how I was explaining this. And then Nehemiah's listened to me for 45 cities do this.
I hope we understand that what he's saying is that he was reading into the Aramaic text something that wasn't really there, according to Nehemiah Gordon. And he was saying where it said Joseph, son of Yaakov, really was saying Miriam was daughter or child of Yaakov. I think that's what he's saying. Instead of the husband, instead of it saying Joseph is the husband of Miriam, it was saying it was saying Miriam was the son of Yaakov instead of Joseph is the son of Yaakov. Whatever it is, he was trying to say that this is what he understood is the line. So this is not the line of Joseph. This is therefore the line only of Mary. Okay, so Nehemiah Gordon is not trying to correct Mr. Rood at all about the idea that you can count a house from a female, or if you could, what would you need to also prove to make that even possible as a legitimate grounds of finding Jesus is the Davidic heir from a woman only? That's just not the way it's done according to Jews, but we're going to put that to one side. So now we've got that out of the way, and so I read what he had said in my interpretation of what Mr. Rood said. I concluded the same thing that Nehemiah Gordon is saying, is that you can't turn on an ambiguity in the Aramaic word and to reach such a vast conclusion. But apparently, we're now going to learn from Nehemiah Gordon, we're going to learn that indeed in I think he's going to say 3 of the 25, 26 manuscripts of the Shem Tob that he looked at, and Professor Howard, for his book, The Hebrew Matthew, only had 9. He now has a much more extensive library, and he found 3 readings that do agree that Miriam is in the line just as the last in line. And so this is really the genealogy of Mary. Now, he's not telling you that in a debate with Christians, the Jews have to come up with some agreement on the virgin birth. And if this is what they can come up with, I'm going to just tell you, if you ask Nehemiah, if truthfully, are the Jews laughing at the Christians for believing that the Jews are pointing at Miriam as the last in line and she's the mother of Jesus? And I think he'd have to say, of course they're laughing at you guys. They're just telling you something that you're going to accept, but we Jews would never accept Miriam is the Davidic lineage that leads to Jesus. That because it doesn't run that way. It goes through and Tovia Singer uses this effectively, and he shows you the passages from the Bible that say we count the lines of the lineages through the male line, not through the female line. It's just the way it is. It's just the way the Bible, God set it up, so you can't change these things. So this should not be taken seriously, but Nehemiah Gordon is going to back him up that yes, this is what he found, and that's all he's saying. So don't read too much into it. So let's hear the rest of this story. But it's a good story. It's a very heartwarming story that his friend, Mr. Rood, gets vindicated in his not misreading, but his overzealous reading of the Aramaic. It's going to be backed up by the Hebrew that's found in the Shem Tob of the 1300s. These are the 1200s to 1300s for these disputations.
Just very briefly, because we're running out of time here, we'll come back and talk more about some of the other things. But the bigger problem in Matthew chapter 1, and we talk about this, Keith and I, in the Hebrew Gospel Pearls, the first episode, and I want to call on people to go and watch it at nehemiahswall.com and bfainternational.com. Now, in that, we go into great detail and we explain what the bigger problem is. The bigger problem isn't 13 and 14 generations. That's an issue. The bigger problem is Matthew gives the genealogy of Joseph, the adopted father of Yeshua, and Luke gives the genealogy of Joseph, the adopted father of Yeshua. And from David through Joseph, they're completely different genealogies. Mm-hmm. Right. And one of them is through Solomon, and the other is through Nathan. Their fathers are completely different genealogies. This has been something that the church fathers, beginning around the 3rd century, struggled with, and they came up with all kinds of creative explanations, exegetical explanations. And some of them are so convoluted, you can't even believe it. That the father of Joseph,
don't even bother with it. I know, it is convoluted.
Things. And the reason they come up with these explanations is, we say in Hebrew, they're doing eights in the air to try to, they're doing mental gymnastics in order to try to explain why Matthew is one explanation, one genealogy from David to Joseph, and Luke has a different genealogy.
Yeah, let me bring up here, Nehemiah. This was question number 10 on the $10,000 reward for any Christian who can answer these questions out of the New Testament. Question number 10, show from the Christian Bible that Yeshua is any relative of King David, because you can't do it. It's impossible. That's why the $10,000 reward.
Okay, so here we have this problem between Matthew and Luke. It's an age-old problem. It's such a big problem that the church father known as St. Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, actually relates that he lost his faith as a child because he read the Gospels. He was raised, in this Christian background, read the Gospel of Matthew, read the Gospel of Luke, and said, this is all lies. They can't even get it straight who the ancestor of Joseph is. He later, he regained his faith through these different complicated explanations, but it's not a new problem, right? So when these Jews were challenging you, Michael, they knew what they were talking about. They've seen in history that this is something that Christians have struggled with. Now, I heard you teach in 42 different times that the Aramaic has guvra, which normally means husband, but here maybe it means father. And I'm thinking, I'm sorry, I remain totally unconvinced from the Aramaic. And my reason was that if I just read the Aramaic and didn't know about Luke, I would never in a million years think that guvra or gever means the father. It clearly would mean the husband, certainly in a Jewish context. It's ish, which is man, which is, when does ish mean father? It seems very convoluted. You're bringing information into the story in order to make it mean father. So I had this information just in the back of my head, and I'm sitting at the Jewish National and University Library in the basement. As this is being recorded, it's now today called the National Library of Israel at the Institute of Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts. And I'm going through the different manuscripts of Hebrew Matthew, and I'm cataloging what there is and what there isn't. And I first find two manuscripts, first I find one, and I look at it, and it's I won't go into too much detail, but basically it only includes Matthew chapter 1. And it only includes chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. And it only includes really the genealogy without all the extra story around it. But right there in black and white, it says, or it's actually brown and another shade of brown, but back then it was black and white on the microfilm reader. It said, Yosef Avi Miriam, Joseph, the father of Miriam. And I was shocked. And then I look at another one, and I find two manuscripts, one in New York and one in Oxford, one at the Jewish Theological Seminary and the other at Oxford University at the Bodleian Libraries. And they both have Yosef Abi Miriam, Joseph, the father of Miriam. And I contacted you, I think, immediately. I call you up and I say, Michael, you're not going to believe what I just found. And I send you a little photo that I took. And from the microfilm reader, I wasn't supposed to do that, so I was kind of sneaking with my phone from the microfilm reader to show you that here it said in black and white, Joseph, the father of Miriam, what you had hypothesized and what many others before you had hypothesized, going back to, as far as I know, 1964, there was a scholar named Blair who published a very serious journal article arguing that the explanation here is that originally it was Joseph, the father of Miriam, and I blunder into two manuscripts where it literally says, we're not hypothesizing about what it might say, it says Joseph, the father of Miriam. And in my field, Michael, that's so important because a lot of what's done in the study of ancient texts is what's called speculation. It's what's called an emendation. An emendation is a speculative suggestion of what it originally read. What we now have is a textual variance, meaning we actually have two manuscripts where it says Joseph, the father of Miriam. It's no longer speculation. Now, you could say those texts are corrupt, and you still want to go with the Greek and the same text that Augustine of Hippo struggled with, right? No problem. But we now, as a fact, have two texts.
Okay, so what did we learn from Mr. Nehemiah? So basically, he says that there are two manuscripts that have Joseph was the father of Miriam. We're going to show you how that reads by looking at this chart here. So just change it. Jacob begat Joseph, the father of Miriam. That's what he says. Joseph, the father of Miriam, is what it says. And what Rood was arguing is looking at Aramaic text, instead of it saying the word husband, which is the alternative to the word father, he said the Aramaic text said father. So now they can come in line with what he was speculating, but pushing as if it were really in the Aramaic text. And Nehemiah Gordon couldn't go along with that. Now Nehemiah Gordon found two manuscripts, not three. I was misspoken earlier. Two manuscripts, one of which was oddly where just the genealogy is present. No other part of the text is present. I'd be curious about the other one. And what's clear also is it was only up to verse 16. So very important was, what did verse 21 and 25 say? Because is it begotten to how's it expressed? Because that's where you have to express the relationship to the parent. And so was it a son of Joseph, or was it only a son of Mary? Because is it somehow an adopted son of Joseph? And so there's this. The language will betray what is the real understanding of whoever put these words in here. And anyway, so Jacob begat Joseph, the father of Miriam, of whom was born Jesus, is what he is saying. It says in the Shem Tob in two manuscripts of how many? 26 that he had looked at. And he looked at all 26. And by the way, because his friend was saying something that was very, he couldn't back up, he is literally going to see if he can find any one of the Shem Tob manuscripts that will agree with his friend. And that's, you have to say, he wouldn't just give up on his friend, and I think that's very commendable. So Nehemiah Gordon deserves a check mark of a good mensch. But on the other hand, Mr. Rood should never have made statements that put his friend in that kind of a bind and claim Nehemiah Gordon was backing him up. But in the end, Nehemiah Gordon did back him up as to two manuscripts. But we still have the problem of this doesn't prove anything. And so that's the real thing. Could you convince a Jewish person based on those two manuscripts that the Shem Tob era, 1300s, is a way of knowing what it read initially, particularly because what I've told you is what they're doing is they're preparing for basically death matches, that if they say anything wrong, they're going to be killed. And one of the things to say wrong is there's no virgin birth. So this could have been the solution that they had come up with. And just the fact that the 16 verses are all on one little sheet, like a cheat sheet, suggests to me is that if they were pushed against the wall, this is what they were told to say. So they're preparing for the meeting. And so if someone says, do you deny the virgin birth? Then they would say, no, 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 no. Or the Davidic say, we believe in the Davidic lineage of Jesus through Miriam. And they go, whoa, how was that? And now you have to know Jerome also championed this idea, but not in the Matthew, but in the Luke. He was claiming that it must be that the Lucan genealogy is of Mary, even though that's preposterous too, because over there it's even more clear it's from Joseph, because it's, it mentions later in Luke that they had to go to Bethlehem to have the census done, and that was because it was a town of Joseph. He was of the lineage of David. Period. Doesn't say because Mary and Joseph were of the lineage of David, which would be a natural thing to say if that was the intention of why they both went, that they're both from the city of David. And they're not. So anyway, and then we haven't even gotten over the next hurdle, which will be what Tobias Singer will bring up, is it doesn't matter. Even if it came from Miriam, Mary, it wouldn't matter, because that's not how you count lineages. Okay. So this is where you end up. And I think we can confidently say the only thing left is, can you think you're going to be able to convince Jewish people or anybody that Jesus has a Davidic lineage based on the evidence you can see so far? And if you think so, great, but I don't see it. Okay. And it's not that I don't want to see it. I'd love to see it. It's just, it doesn't make any sense that it would be traced to the lineage of Mary anyway. Okay. So that never worked. Even when Jerome suggested it, didn't work, because I already knew, and I think most people should know, that when God talks about lineages from a tribal lineage, and all that is through the male line, for whatever reason, the women get other things, the men get the line issue, and that goes through their line, and that's how it's counted. And so it has to be Joseph was the intended target of this, and it's in both. That's a troublesome thing. But anyway, so now I think we've come to the end of the story. So what I'm going to say, and take this with a grain of salt, is you can no longer use the video of Mr. Rood talking about anything about the Aramaic text, because he himself has admitted it was wrong in that final video. So there's this, the Raiders of the Lost, I forget what it's called, but his Raiders of the Lost Ark type series, well, what he said there is completely debunked by his own expert, Nehemiah Gordon. So that is gone, and you have to ignore and not pass that on, because that's incorrect. It's also, he debunked himself his own book, where he does the chronology of the gospel accounts, and it's a debunked, and that's all based on his reading of an Aramaic text, a Peshitta text, where he was reading into something, and Nehemiah Gordon says, you would never imagine that, and so and Nehemiah Gordon is solely relying upon the Hebrew Shem Tob. He's not reading any Aramaic text, which what he's saying is, in Hebrew, in Aramaic, you would never conclude that it is anything but husband, Joseph, the husband of Mary, instead of Joseph, the father of Mary. And so these two errant variants, they do exist, apparently. I'm going to take his word for it, although it's not published and it doesn't appear anywhere that you can find. But he took a snapshot with one of the two things on the screen. He's not allowed to do that, apparently, but somehow he'll one day publish an official article that can be backed up by other scholars. And if that day ever comes and it can be documented, and you don't have to rely upon these videos, then maybe some people will put some credence in it and go that way. Now, I'm not going to say they shouldn't believe it at all. It depends upon whether they can overcome Tobias Singer's objection that it's not of a male line, and that it could still be considered valid tracing to the Davidic line, and Jesus could belong to the Davidic house. So what's the better evidence? I think it's just conclusively, it has to be that the evidence we showed you in the prior episode is the best evidence. And that is, Paul 3 times says Jesus of the seed of David, of David. So that's 3 times there, and then 3 times in the early literature, twice with Justin, and once in the Aquila book. And then both those 3 episodes or 3 texts say Joseph begat Jesus. And then you have the Syriac Sinaiticus found by Agnes, I think her name is Lewis. and her books were published in 1894 and again in 1896, I think it was. And they are the translations of the Syriac Sinaiticus. And so we have abundant evidence that proves, objectively speaking, that it once read Joseph begat Jesus. And also, if you study the book of Luke and the history of the Marcionites, that when Marcion created a gospel, he created a gospel that everyone thought was based on Luke, and but it was missing the genealogies and virgin birth. So people said, this is strange, because Marcion's belief is Jesus was God from birth, and he was just appeared to be human. So why would he get rid of the virgin birth and the genealogies, which would help confirm his case? Well, that to me proves that they weren't there. That's one of the arguments against the virgin birth ever being in Luke originally, because Marcion should have had it in his gospel, but he doesn't. What it also proves, though, is according to Professor Evans, he says that Marcion created his gospel from, Professor Evans says, that the Hebrew Matthew is what was the basis of the Luke gospel, excuse me. So Luke's gospel is from the Hebrew Matthew at that time, the real one, the one that was at Caesarea until 293 AD, when Jerome does his own translation into Latin and Greek of that text. So, and that's where it had been preserved, so nobody could corrupt it. And that's why it didn't have the virgin birth. And that's what Marcion was doing. He simply copied the Hebrew Matthew as it existed, and he was making up his own stories that would lead one to believe that Jesus was God from birth. So, and that probably is what led to the creation of the virgin birth myth. Okay, anyway, I hope this helps everybody. God bless. Take care.